Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Caleb Zachrin, editor of the New Books Network. Today I'm speaking with Lorna Gibb about her new book, Rare Tongues: The Secret Stories of Hidden Languages. Lorna is Associate Professor of Creative Writing and Linguistics at the University of Stirling. In our age of globalizing culture and communication, languages are homogenizing and rare ones are dying out. Languages aren't just tools for communication. They're windows into different worlds. In Rare Tongues, Lorna takes readers on a journey through these worlds. She explores how languages develop, why they sound the way they do, how they die, and how they are reborn. She just looks at some of the world's rarest languages, exploring how and why they survive and what makes them unique. If you're fascinated by languages, Rare Tongues will entertain and delight you. Lorna, thanks for joining me today on the New Books Network.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, this is such a fun book. It's really clear that you had a very broad audience in mind. I feel like languages is one of those languages or linguistics is one of those topics where, maybe not the most detailed thing that everyone is interested in, but like everyone on some level, I feel like is interested in languages, fascinated by them. Whether it's just, the nature of their own language that they speak, their native language, or just another language. I know very few people that don't have some other language that they are, enthralled by on some level. And I think that this book does a really great job of highlighting languages that people might not immediately think of or might not immediately come to mind. But before jumping in and talking about the book, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I've always worked across two disciplines. So I have a PhD in linguistics, but really for the past 20 years, I guess, I have written mostly mainstream books. So fiction, biographies, memoir, general nonfiction. And for this book, for the first time, I wanted to bring the two things that I love together. So I wanted to write a book for a broad readership, not for a particularly exclusively academic one that would kind of look at what's a big issue, this kind of loss of multiculturalism within language, but also just be a kind of introduction, as you say, hopefully fun, to some of the more esoteric and interesting and surprising languages that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. You cover so many languages. I have to confess, I don't think I knew or had heard of half of the languages that you reference in the book. So it's really fascinating to see how you go through the languages, or at least languages that I thought of as being dialects, but as you show are really unique unto themselves. You begin the book by talking about Latin, which I think Latin is one of those languages where at least I can't speak for necessarily the Spanish or Italian speaking world. I'm sure that they might learn it too in elementary school, but in a lot of English language schools, people learn Latin, even though Latin is considered to a certain extent a dead language. Obviously maybe the cardinals still speak it, or some of them still speak it. But can you talk a little about like Latin and why it's such an interesting language?
Yeah, one of the main things about this book is it's in a way the weaving thread is memoir. So it's although there are lots of unusual languages in it, there are a ton more that could have been in it but aren't just because there's not space. So I was choosing languages that were particularly important to me or that I felt offered something to say about the other languages that we would touch on. And that's where Latin comes in. So it's perfect for both of these things. From a personal level, in the UK, Latin now in schools is very much a class marker. So I'm fortunately of the age where I could grow up in a council estate, go to a comprehensive school, a not very good school in a rough area, and still have Latin as an option. You won't find that now. Now Latin is something you learn in private schools. So you have to go to a fee-paying school in order to, most of the time, there may be some exceptions you go to. So it marks you as someone from a kind of posher background. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to mention it, because the possibility of taking Latin is restricted now. And I think it's a bad thing. for me, Latin opened a kind of world. So it's where I started to think about things like cases in languages. It's where I really fell in love with the way that language could teach us so much about history and teach us so much about what went before, the kind of traces of the language. And also, in a practical level, it led to me getting great jobs when I was an undergraduate and had absolutely no money. So I came up from Scotland where Latin was still offered, and within a couple of months got a great job translating Latin for one of the academics in my department. So for me, it's always been a thing about opportunity. And then later, when I worked on Finnish, I found that these incredibly difficult case systems that Finnish has were easier for me than for some people, simply because I had learned half of them when I was studying Latin.
Interesting. Yeah. And obviously, you know, there's a lot of the languages that you cover in this book. Yeah, they're they're they might be very interesting in themselves, but might not necessarily be as useful for learning other languages. But Latin is very unique in the sense that by learning Latin or just understanding even a little bit of Latin, you can really start to put the pieces together for many languages. You look at it in your language development chapter, the first one. You also look at the language, the Manchu language. Can you share a little about this language and why you put it up against Latin?
Because they are both languages that had very significant heydays in the past and that only have kind of remnants remaining. And because Manchu is so often overlooked, and it's not, I mean, people know about Latin. They Many people recognize its importance in learning Romance languages and so on, whereas not many people in the West know about Manchu and how great and powerful an empire it was once the language of. And now it's very much groups of people really trying to work hard to reawaken it, as it were. And I find the parallel really interesting.
You look at you also in the book look at Khoisan, which I think is a language that people, if they if they're not familiar with it by name, then they might even be familiar with it by sound, because I feel like it's often used to sort of illustrate a very unique language. Could you talk about this language and why it's such a unique one?
So Khoi Khoi for me was important in the sense that, again, it was a language I started working on when I was a postgraduate student in London. And I started working on it because I was offered a job helping to write a computer dictionary of Nama, as it was called then, but which I've since learned is not the best way to refer to the language. And of course, things changed with history. I did my master's degree quite a long time ago. So, but Khoi Khoi, as we now know it, so that's how I got introduced to it, really. And it wasn't a language I had thought about working on. Um, and it just was such an interesting, intriguing language because of the different phonetic clicks, which are the things most people will be familiar with. There's the music of Miriam Makeba and how that kind of showcases some of those really unusual phonetic properties of the language. And I then became more interested in some of the issues I talk about in the book. So through Namibian and South African activists, because the language is also spoken in South Africa, I became very interested in the way that colonialism has affected that language and the way that activists in South Africa are fighting to have the language recognized as one of the official languages of that country. And was really interesting to speak to a prominent activist about the way that the words in his language that have filtered through to common day usage are generally about forgetting and loss and all the things that he felt were affected in language itself. I can't really do this whole story justice in a chat show, but it's really one of the most powerful messages and stories in the book. This story of activists fighting to have their language, their words recognized.
What does that process look like? What are some of the main strategies that activists employ to fight for these endangered languages?
They try to make the language popular. They try to have events. Theatre is fantastic. Theatre in the language. They have campaigns to raise awareness of the way the language may have been appropriated. Um, in, this is not just a story for Khoikhoi. There are other languages where it's also an issue. So in Poland, we have Wymosaurus, and there an activist has set up an amazing campaign to introduce speakers around the world to his language. And they have meetups online. They have these big international learning groups where people join together to learn Wymosaurus, just because these people are interested in learning such an unusual and rare language. And then, of course, there's lots of internet programs and so on. Silver Manchu, which you mentioned, there are online forums where you can meet and speak to other Manchu speakers and practice your language and try to get reacquainted with it.
Yeah, you look in the book at a variety of different. You kind of do a tour around the globe of all sorts of languages that are either considered endangered or are very rare languages spoken in India, in South America, in Europe. What are some of the languages that you personally just have found really fascinating to learn about or there's the story of how people are trying to keep them alive that you find really inspiring?
I think the two languages for me that were, the two kind of sets of languages for me that were most exciting to learn about was Plain Sign Language in the States, so hand talk. I didn't know till I started researching this book that there was at one time a lingua franca for huge swathes of the US that was a signed language, and indeed was used for communication between Native Americans and settlers and colonizers and explorers. So this language was used as the main means of communication. And to learn that this was still in existence and to hear the stories of Native Americans who almost used it like a secret method of communication when their own tongues were banned in white schools and so on was incredibly fascinating. And I had the pleasure to meet a signer at one point during my research, and that was beautiful to watch, because for me it was a very distinct method of communication. So I loved that, and I loved the history. And the other group that I really loved were the whistled languages. And I touch on quite a few in the book, not just El Silbo from Gomera, which is the one that most people here, I'm not sure about in the US, will know, spoken in the Canary Islands, or rather whistled in the Canary Islands. And the bird language of Kuskoy, which I did know because I had spent quite a lot of time in Turkey during my studies. But the various kinds of whistling languages and their prevalence all over the world was really wonderful to study and also just to listen to. I think generally these languages spring up where there are geographic difficulties to overcome in communication. So mountains, forests, vast distances between houses, because the sound that is whistled travels much better than one that is shouted. So that's why they developed. Obviously, they are threatened by the advent of mobile phones, which makes them in some way redundant, but they perform other functions in some languages that won't be replicated by mobile phones. So in those cases, the whistling remains and retains its distinct identity within that culture.
Yeah, you have a section which seems in many ways sort of fitting with the sad passage of Pope Francis on the language of Jesus, which Jesus would have spoken Aramaic, and you talk about that there is still a language that is descendant from Aramaic that is still spoken today. So what was the language of Jesus, and what can you tell us about the language today that is spoken that's most similar to it?
Um, that language is quite threatened because of the state of wars. The language I speak about isn't actually exactly Aramaic, and I'm not an expert of Aramaic, but I agree it's probably worthy of, because of the sad passing of Pope Francis, it probably is something worth exploring. I haven't done it yet, but the that event kind of brought it to light in quite a touching way. It's interesting, particularly in the sense that, of course, the New Testament is written in ancient Greek, but Jesus spoke Aramaic, and there's a gap between the books. So it's quite interesting to think about the translation of the stories and the consistency of the stories despite those translations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think work on that would be really interesting, and it definitely does, lead one to ask, I think, a lot of questions about that gap and why now that occurred. Um, what I find really interesting too is something that you point out, like as you said, some languages like a whistle language is suited to the environment, and also there are vocabularies that are suited to a particular environment. Certain languages there where in a particular region they have a lot of meaning because they might refer to certain species of animals, or species of plants that otherwise, without that language, they don't exist. They don't exist in any other language. So, what are some of the things that you learned about languages and how they relate to their environment that they're spoken in?
Hawaiian is a very good example of that because the Hawaiian language has a particular relationship with both the land itself and the creatures within it, but also of their importance to the way of life, the belief system, and the interaction between Hawaiian people and the land they inhabit on. The other one is Nujak, which also gives lots of hints into seasonal kind of differences, seasonal properties of fish movements and so on, that without those nuances of those particular languages are very difficult to encapsulate in English without losing some of the meaning. And then, of course, there's medicine, medicinal plants who in some cases may not even have names in English or Latin that we can relate to, but which have distinct names in their own language within their environments, and which offer cures.
Yeah, that's incredible. And really interesting, just to think about, the languages that have died and how that leads us to not being able to understand certain things because, if it was something that was figured out and, or discussed in one language, but then, once another language comes in to displace it, then you don't have access to that information anymore. I'm curious, I'm curious, you have a section in the book which looks at some of the rare tongues of Europe. And I think that a lot of a lot of people are very familiar, a lot, or have their second languages of European languages, be it like Spanish or German or French. But there's so many more languages in Europe that are spoken. I was recently, in Spain, and in Spain alone, there's so many different languages there that are spoken beyond Spanish. What's like the language in Europe that is not often discussed that you find most interesting?
I think here people are more aware of them, but they may not be aware of the traditional differences, or they may think of them as just dialects rather than actual languages. I think Euskara is really interesting because of the kind of culture of Bertolaritza, which I do talk about in the book, which in some ways reminded me of a rap contest of all things. So I found that a really interesting glimpse into something that didn't seem particularly stereotypically Spanish, even though we still regard the vast region as part of Spain. Um, I love Sicilian, partly because I lived in Italy and can speak and understand Italian, but Sicilian baffles me. So it's like a constant struggle. And I keep thinking I should be able to understand this, but I don't. What's that word? What does it mean? So I love the richness of the Sicilian vocabulary, and I like some of the kind of imagery. So like the word for a snail shell is very similar to the word, or even the same depending on what region you're in, as the word for spiral staircase, which I find really nice. So there are lovely little incidental things you find out. And of course there's Gaelic, the language of the Highlands of Scotland, which does have support from our government, but many speakers would say that it's not doing well. And the book includes an interview with a Gaelic speaker who worries about the current state of the language and recounts his own attempts to learn it, because even though it's his language, it's the language of his culture, he's not really been immersed in it. And we had this really interesting conversation about how it's such a difficult language to learn properly if you're not brought up in it, and very few people are now, because there's nowhere you can go to really be completely immersed in it. So that's interesting. I was also very interested in Mimosaurus, which I mentioned before, which is this little niche language in Poland. I'm interested in Sami, which I talk about in the book because I'd lived in Finland for a couple of years and grew to know many Sami people and to really appreciate their way of seeing the world and their spiritual connection to the world, which is very much encapsulated in some of the words and the structures in their language. But there's so many, really.
And Sami's a really interesting language because I feel like it doesn't bear relation to a lot of other European languages. What do we know about the where Sami comes from?
Well, Sami is very similarly in structure to Finnish, so it has all those interesting kind of geminates and doubling vowels. So it's quite similar to Finnish in one sense, but in another sense it's not, because the vocabulary is quite different. But it's certainly part of that kind of group of languages, even if its worldview, if you want to call it that, is a different one.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that you look at in the book is this process of language revival, either languages that were endangered then have come back, or languages that in many ways were a significant portion of the vocabulary were sort of recreated or rethought of, like Hebrew and also the Maori language. What could you talk a little bit about these two languages and their return to force?
Um, the Hebrew language is unique amongst the languages that I know about, in the sense that it was a sheer act of will to revive it and to give it the power. Sorry, I should say modern Hebrew, and the widespread use that it has now. Maori is very different, but was very personal to me because my husband is half. It was brought up in New Zealand and is half Kiwi, so. I was very interested to hear from him about what his experience and exposure to the Maori language was growing up, and what the current exposure to the Maori language is now that there have been all these attempts at revival, and the difference is immense. It's absolutely immense. So you can hear mainstream singers with songs and music on Maori on the radio. Most people will learn some Maori in school and will have a much better understanding of the culture. I'm not saying it's enough. It probably isn't. I'm not going to speak for Maori people because I know that many of them feel the language is not fully embraced within the culture, even though it's actually the first language of the culture, as it were, or at least belongs to that group of languages. That was the first language of the culture. But it is amazing to see the kind of transformation from it being an afterthought to being something that at least some of the population are now consciously thinking about, striving to integrate and incorporate more into society, and it's becoming more a part of everyday life for everyone.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's interesting also to compare it with with what you were saying about Gaelic, and you know it's obviously quite different in many ways, the story, stories about it, around it, but it's like I have a friend who's Irish, and there's a whole different he has a whole different vocabulary in many ways when when he's talking with his parents. He talks very differently than when he does when he talks with me. And you talk a little about this in your book, just the experience of having a different sort of set of words, even if it's a different dialect. What is that experience like? What do you think is important about preserving these kind of local ways of talking?
I think, first of all, it's important to not always think of them as dialects, which many people do. So I do speak Scots with my mum because, well, I suppose it's a kind of hybrid Scots because I use a very large vocabulary from Scots when I speak with my mum because it's how she was brought up speaking, really. What's And I think that some of those, I can give you some examples. So there are words like smith, which means this kind of damp, incessant rain that we have a lot of in Scotland. And it really, there are other words like currying together, which means cuddling together. And we often use it for when the weather's really bad outside and we are at home with our family or our loved ones. We'll say we are currying together. And those kind of expressions really mean home to me and mean family. And I've lived in many, many places. So although I'm working in Scotland now, I only came back to Scotland 2.5 years ago. And we've lived in many, many countries in the kind of 30 years before that. So for me, coming back and hearing those words that were still very much part of my life experience has been really nice. It feels familiar. And they also describe things at times like smear, for example, that you can't really describe in standard English words without an explanation. So as I said, it's a soft, wet, persistent rain, but you have to say all of that for one word.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting that it's that the words that are kind of references to weather, ecological, they're like ecological explanations, which in many ways is, I think, part of what you say in the book is that a lot of the words that might exist in one language and not another have to do with the very sort of unique, ecological environment that is how the word might have come about. But that's something that I always was thinking about just with this book. Is it's all about it's about rare languages and languages that people don't often think about, and unique languages. And there's a language that's, I don't even know if it's even if anyone even speaks anymore, but Esperanto, which is the sort of the language that for listeners that aren't familiar, an attempt to create a universal language that everyone can speak. And obviously it wasn't really successful, but in many ways I still feel like the spirit of Esperanto is people sort of try and keep it alive in the sense where people talk about, oh, AI will automatically translate anything you say, so there's no need to learn other languages, or emojis. You just communicate through emojis with people, and you don't need to you don't need to learn their language. So, what do you think about these kind of projects to create a universal language?
Esperanto does still exist. It has kind of scattered aficionados and speakers around the globe. I think English has in many ways become the kind of Esperanto, the default language. It's most people's second language if they're going to have one, if it's not their first language, and so on. But I'm quite skeptical about things like AI translation because I think we're going to lose all nuance, all subtlety, all kind of human interpretation of words from one language to another. I am not by any means a professional interpreter or translation. Even the languages I do speak, I certainly do not know well enough for that. And I feel that a lot of AI translation is simply matching matching vocabulary, matching similar concepts without actually engaging with those concepts and thinking how they mean and thinking how they should be interpreted contextually, really. So I personally don't think they are in any way, shape, or form a substitute for proper translation and interpreting work. Emojis are a step even further away from nuance and and expression and sharing. I don't think emojis are so much of a threat because I see them as an additional thing, a kind of quick shorthand. I think what I am interested in, because I used to be a programmer, is computer languages. And while they don't communicate in the same way, they offer a way of doing things. So I'm quite in a kind of nerdy sort of way interested in thinking about what the syntax of different languages do. Although I haven't programmed for many, many years, so my languages are very old fashioned now, and I doubt anybody really cares what Prolog does or Icon or maybe even C++, because I think they all moved ahead now. So, but I was interested in that and still am to some extent, but it's a different kind of language.
Yeah, absolutely. I, I do think, and it does seem that a lot of work that, philosophers of language and linguists work on now, a lot of them do look at computer programming as a way of thinking about language and syntax and, exactly what what you're saying. I think it is the case, and to a certain extent, that there are people who, live in different places and, might have different languages, but they communicate, but they work on the same code base. So it is interesting to think about that. Sort of like a fun question. Is there any language that you don't speak where if you could kind of just snap your fingers and be fluent in it that you would like to be able to speak?
Yes, Spanish. Absolutely Spanish. I am still trying to learn Spanish, but if I could have one language that I could read, write, speak absolutely fluently, it would be Spanish. And I hope one day I can at least have a glimmer of fluency. Um, and everybody says, you study Latin, you speak Italian, it must be easy. No, it's not. I get L2, like second language interference, all the time. I start out trying to say something in Spanish. I end up using an Italian word. I sound like I have an Italian accent when I'm trying to speak Spanish. My Spanish is appalling. And yes, I can learn the grammar. And yes, I can kind of work out some of the words, even if I don't know them. But I make far too many mistakes all the time. And I love Spanish literature. So I just would love to be able to read it easily and communicate easily, but I can't.
Yeah, it's definitely, and obviously Spanish too, like English in many ways is, one of those languages where depending on where you go, there's completely different ways in which, different vocabulary, different ways that people speak. And I remember even, I've unfortunately lost most of my Spanish, but I studied it, in elementary, middle school, and high school. And I remember always there would be this adjustment because I would have different teachers that were, from different countries or they spoke in Spanish in a different way, and I would adjust. So the Spanish that I did end up learning was a kind of a mishmash of Castilian Spanish or Mexican Spanish, and it is an amazing language, and I think it incredibly useful, and especially like I'm in the United States where it's just you hear Spanish spoken all the time. People are constantly speaking Spanish, so it really is the second language here, and I think that's a great thing in many ways. I think it's a great thing that we have multiple languages that people are speaking. So
I
yeah, I think
everyone expects me to say something more exotic, but it has to be Spanish. And we had this ridiculous thing in Scotland when I was young. I'm not sure if it's still the same. We don't have kids, so I don't actually know. But I grew up in quite a sectarian area, so there are Catholic schools and Protestant schools. And if you were unfortunate enough to go to a Protestant school, as I was, your choice is French or German. If you get to go to a Roman Catholic school, you get Spanish and Italian.
Right.
So
Yeah. It makes perfect sense.
so it makes it. And I deep resented, even then, as a 13-year-old, not being able to do Spanish because I liked so much Latin American music. I had very romantic ideas about Spain, but it's still a country I love. And I've also I always feel really bad because a few years ago I wrote a novel which there are some academics in Spain who work on, and they've written, there's a really lovely academic article about my novel. So I went over there to speak and give a talk, and of course I have to do everything in English, which I really don't like doing. I think given that they've all taken the taken the time to learn English and even write in English about that, I feel I should really be able to communicate. So I'm doing Duolingo, but that is it is very American, Latin American Spanish rather than Castilian Spanish. And I'm about to start online chat lessons with someone. So we'll see how I go.
Well, yeah, that's I wish you luck in that. I think it's it's always so hard. I feel like I'm caught. There's like so many languages that I want to learn. I try and I'll be, this problem with Duolingo is that it's like amazing. Like you can learn all these languages, but then I will spend one day learning German and I'll be like, well, let me try Mandarin. And I'll be like, oh, that's way too hard. You can't learn yet.
That would probably be my number 2 language. I think Mandarin would be the second language that I would wish I could speak. But I'm not even going to try that now.
Yeah, I have a friend who spent he spent 2 years living in China, and I asked him, should I learn? It was like, oh, is it, how do you know? It must be so great that you're fluent in Mandarin. Now he's like, I'm not even close to being fluent. I still barely know the tones. I was like, oh gosh. I know it's a really difficult language for English language speakers to learn, but I think it's amazing, just like the variety of languages, because I do think, like, as especially as your book shows, like even the even the variety that most people think of as what the differences between certain languages, it expands so much. Languages with clicking sounds, languages with whistle tones, languages that are just that use hand expression. It's like it really is remarkable, and I think that this book is a really great tour through different languages. So and as you said, like it's clearly written in a way that a non-expert who's just interested in languages can really easily read it and understand the ideas that you put forth. So yeah, it's a fun read, and I definitely recommend people go out and read Rare Tongue. So Lorna, thank you so much for being a guest on the New Books Network. It was really wonderful to speak with you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks for having me.